We live in a world that never seems to stop. Phones buzz with late-night notifications, screens glow with endless scrolling, and somehow, even at midnight, it feels like we're still on the clock. We spend billions on memory foam mattresses, white noise machines, blackout curtains, even apps that promise to hack our sleep. And yet, so many of us still wake up groggy, still toss and turn, still feel like that perfect night's rest is just out of reach. But what if we're looking in the wrong direction? What if the best sleep secrets aren't in the newest technology, but in the way people lived hundreds of years ago, when life was slower, nights were quieter, and sleep itself was sacred? Tonight, let's step back in time to find out. There's something almost magical about how people in the Middle Ages viewed sleep. For them, it wasn't something to squeeze in after a long day or a number on a smartwatch app telling them they needed 8 solid hours. Sleep was far more than that. It was sacred, a gift from God Himself, woven into the rhythm of life as naturally as eating, praying, or breathing. When night fell in a medieval village, the entire pace of life shifted. Imagine this: no traffic lights glowing red, no neon signs buzzing, no endless scroll of screens pulling at your attention. The day ended when the sun went down, and darkness became an invitation to rest, not a problem to overcome. Sleep wasn't a luxury or an inconvenience, it was an essential part of being alive. People didn't stress about whether they were sleeping right. They weren't comparing their nightly hours to a recommended chart or lying in bed worrying about tomorrow's alarm. They simply trusted their bodies. When they felt tired, they went to sleep. When their eyes opened naturally in the morning, it was time to wake up. In a world without alarm clocks screaming at 6 a.m., there was no jolt of anxiety pulling someone out of a dream. Instead, waking up was a slow and gentle process, sometimes to the faint light of dawn, sometimes to the sound of a rooster or church bell ringing softly in the distance. What's remarkable is how differently they viewed the act of sleeping compared to our modern mindset. Today, we talk about sleep hygiene and try to optimize every minute of rest as though it were a business metric. Back then, it was simply part of life, a natural rhythm like the tide coming in and out. Sleep wasn't earned after working late, it wasn't pushed aside so someone could get one more thing done. It was expected, respected, and deeply valued. There was a kind of spiritual dimension to it too. Many medieval writings describe sleep as a state where the soul could rest and even connect with the divine. People often prayed before bed, not out of ritual habit, but because they saw sleep as a form of surrender, placing themselves, body and soul, in God's hands for the night. That mindset created something we don't often talk about today: peace of mind before falling asleep. No rushing thoughts about deadlines or messages left unread. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. This was the time to rest, and that rest had purpose. And because there were no clocks telling them they were behind schedule, there was no anxiety about how many hours they had left before morning. If someone woke up in the middle of the night, and many people did, they didn't panic about losing sleep. In fact, waking up at midnight for a quiet moment of prayer, or to sit by the fire and think, was completely normal. This flexibility allowed people to return to bed without stress, slipping into a second, peaceful stretch of sleep until dawn. This relaxed approach to rest gave them something we often struggle with today: freedom from the pressure of sleep itself. Think about it: how many times have you laid in bed thinking, if I fall asleep now, I'll get 6 hours, then 5.5, then 5. That countdown, that performance mindset about rest, didn't exist in the medieval world. They didn't track it, they didn't compete over it, and they certainly didn't see it as wasted time. Instead, sleep was part of the rhythm of living a balanced life. It was a natural pause, like taking a breath, a simple and essential gift to be embraced rather than fought against. And because they honored it, they often got better rest than many of us do, even with all our modern technology designed to help us sleep. So when we look back and wonder how people hundreds of years ago could have had better quality sleep than we do with our memory foam mattresses and blackout curtains, the answer is surprisingly simple: they respected it. They let go of control and allowed themselves to rest when their bodies asked for it. There was no guilt, no multitasking until the last possible second, no glowing phone screen to disrupt their natural rhythms. It's a lesson that feels almost radical today. Sleep isn't something to fight or conquer. It's something to welcome. The people of the Middle Ages may not have known the word melatonin or studied circadian rhythms, but they lived by them instinctively. In their world, sleep wasn't stolen time, it was sacred time. And maybe, in a way, that's the real secret to why their nights were often more peaceful than ours. One of the most fascinating parts of medieval sleep culture was how differently they structured the night compared to us. Today, we're conditioned to think of sleep as one long, unbroken stretch, ideally 8 hours if we're lucky. We treat it like punching a time clock: get in, shut down, and hope to wake up rested when the alarm rings. But in the Middle Ages, things were not only slower, they were more natural. People didn't expect to stay asleep all night, and they didn't panic if they woke up in the middle of it. In fact, it was completely normal to wake up halfway through the night. They even had a name for it: the first sleep and the second sleep. Here's how it worked. After sundown, most people would settle in fairly early, especially during the colder months when darkness stretched long into the evening. Without electricity, staying up late just didn't make sense. So they would go to bed not long after nightfall and drift into what they called their first sleep. This first stretch lasted about 4 hours, a deep and restful slumber that carried them through the early part of the night. And then, like clockwork, but without a clock, they would wake up. Not because they had insomnia, and not because they were worried or stressed, but because their bodies were used to it. This period of wakefulness, which usually lasted 1 or 2 hours, wasn't seen as a problem. It was an expected and even valued part of the night. People would use this time in different ways. Some would kneel at their bedside and pray, seeing the quiet stillness of midnight as a spiritual moment. Others might talk quietly with a spouse, tend to a small chore, or even read if they were literate and had access to books. In some cases, neighbors or family members would use this hour to talk, share a drink, or check on animals in the barn. Then, when the body naturally signaled it was time again, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which lasted until morning light. There was no anxiety about being awake at night, no frantic tossing and turning trying to force sleep to come. The night had its rhythm, and waking up was part of it. It wasn't wasted time, it was human time, peaceful and unhurried. What's interesting is how modern science actually backs up this older pattern. Studies of circadian rhythms suggest that humans naturally produce a small dip in sleep pressure during the middle of the night, especially when there's no artificial light keeping us awake late into the evening. Essentially, our bodies might still be wired for this two-part sleep schedule. Researchers have even experimented with recreating medieval-like conditions, no electric light, early bedtimes, and found that people often slip right back into this biphasic pattern without trying. It seems our ancestors weren't doing something strange at all, they were doing what came naturally. Think about how different that feels compared to our current mindset. Today, if you wake up at 2 in the morning, what's your first thought? Probably something like, "Oh no, I'm going to be so tired tomorrow." We reach for our phones, stare at the time, and count down the remaining hours we could still sleep if we fall asleep right now. That pressure alone often keeps people awake longer. In the medieval world, there was none of that. Waking up at night wasn't a crisis, it was just life. The first and second sleep pattern even shaped social and spiritual practices. Some historians suggest that midnight prayers became popular because this wakeful period was so common, people literally scheduled their devotion around it. For others, it was a chance to enjoy quiet reflection or intimate moments with family members without the demands of daytime chores. Even their architecture reflected it. Hearths were often kept glowing just enough to offer warmth during those middle hours, allowing people to sit by the fire before heading back under their blankets. The beauty of this approach is that it respected the natural ebb and flow of human energy. People didn't fight their biology, they leaned into it. And because there were no alarm clocks waiting to jolt them awake in the morning, the second sleep could stretch gently into dawn, with waking often triggered by birdsong, the sound of livestock stirring, or soft morning light filtering in through simple windows. So why did this pattern fade? Historians believe industrialization played a big role. As cities grew and work schedules became rigid, the flexibility to wake up in the middle of the night and take your time before sleeping again simply vanished. The invention of streetlights and eventually electric lighting also shifted how late people stayed awake, pushing bedtimes later and compressing sleep into a single block. We started to see sleep as something to manage and optimize, rather than a natural rhythm to follow. It's tempting to wonder what would happen if we returned to something like the medieval model: no phones, no glaring lights, no 24/7 mindset telling us to squeeze productivity out of every waking minute. Would we feel more rested, less anxious about sleep? Would our nights feel longer in the best way, giving us both deep rest and a moment of peace under the stars in the middle of it? The medieval biphasic sleep pattern reminds us that there's more than one way to rest, and that what we consider normal today is really just one version of human behavior shaped by technology and culture. Back then, they listened to their bodies and embraced those natural breaks. And maybe, just maybe, they were better off for it, slipping into slumber twice a night, not because they had to, but because it was simply the way life and nature flowed. One of the greatest differences between medieval nights and our own is the sheer quality of darkness they experienced. For most of human history, nightfall truly meant nightfall, deep, enveloping, almost absolute darkness. There were no neon signs blinking in the distance, no street lamps flooding every corner, no glowing phones lighting up faces long after midnight. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the world became quiet and dark in a way most of us today have never truly experienced. This natural darkness did more than just signal the end of the day, it shaped how people lived and how they slept. In our world, we fight darkness. We flick on switches without thinking, fill every space with artificial light, and extend daytime deep into the night. But in the medieval world, light was precious and costly, and its absence was normal. People adapted to it instead of trying to push it away. The impact on sleep was profound. When the world around you dims completely, your body begins its own transformation. Darkness tells the brain it's time to produce melatonin, the hormone that prepares us for sleep. In our modern environment, especially with screens shining blue light into our eyes, that natural signal gets confused. We scroll and stream right up to bedtime, and then wonder why our minds can't settle. Medieval people never had that problem. Their evenings, bathed in shadow, helped their bodies slide effortlessly into rest. Even when they did need light, it came in the gentlest form. A candle on a wooden table, flickering softly, or a small oil lamp giving off a warm, golden glow. That kind of light didn't overwhelm the senses or disrupt circadian rhythms. It didn't trick the body into thinking it was midday. Instead, it was more like a whisper in the dark, enough to see your hands or read a few words, but not enough to erase the feeling that night had truly arrived. Imagine what that felt like, finishing your evening meal and sitting in a dimly lit room, perhaps with family, maybe telling stories or quietly praying. Outside, the night pressed close against the small windows, full of the distant sounds of wind or the occasional animal. The world itself encouraged slowing down. There was no temptation to keep working into the night, no digital glow coaxing people into one more email or one more episode. When darkness arrived, life gently folded toward rest. We often underestimate just how much constant artificial light affects us today. City dwellers rarely experience true darkness at all, even our bedrooms are often touched by the glow of streetlights, LED clocks, or standby lights from electronics. This low-level illumination can subtly disrupt melatonin production, fragment sleep, and even influence how deeply we rest. Medieval people lived without this interference, and it likely gave them a kind of deep, natural sleep we often crave but rarely achieve. There's also a psychological element to consider. True darkness creates a boundary between day and night, work and rest. In modern life, those boundaries blur. The same room where you eat breakfast might double as your late-night workspace, and your phone keeps you connected to everything long after you've climbed into bed. For medieval villagers, the fall of night created a mental signal: the day is done, the body can rest. That mindset alone has a calming effect, lowering stress and preparing the mind for sleep. And it wasn't just individuals who felt this. Entire communities adapted to darkness. After sunset, villages grew quiet except for essential tasks, like checking on livestock or tending to a hearth. Social events ended earlier, shops closed earlier, and the natural rhythm of society aligned with the rhythm of the sun. Even the architecture reflected this relationship with light and dark. Small, tightly shuttered windows kept homes warm but also meant less light intrusion at night. We know from research today that exposure to natural light during the day and darkness at night is one of the strongest ways to regulate circadian rhythm. In medieval times, this happened automatically. People spent their daylight hours outdoors or near windows, and when night came, it was genuinely dark. The cycle of light and dark was complete, and their bodies responded exactly as nature intended. What's striking is how much of this we now try to artificially recreate. Think of blackout curtains, sleep masks, apps that reduce blue light, and even digital detox recommendations before bedtime. We're essentially chasing what medieval people had by default: a dark, quiet world ready to support deep, natural rest. So, when we imagine a medieval night, it's worth pausing to picture the calm it brought. No glowing screens, no constant hum of electronics, no harsh fluorescent lighting. Just the soft, warm flicker of a candle and the wide, natural dark beyond. That kind of environment does something to a person. It signals safety, calm, and an invitation to surrender to sleep. And in a way, it might explain why they didn't need elaborate tricks or gadgets to rest well. The night itself was enough. Another striking difference between how medieval people slept and how we do today is the way they often shared their sleeping space. In our modern culture, we prize privacy when it comes to sleep. A quiet room, your own bed, a personal bubble, that's the ideal. But for most of history, including the Middle Ages, sleeping alone was unusual. People slept together, sometimes in the same bed, often in the same room, and in many cases, whole families or groups of workers shared a single sleeping space. This wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was about safety. Medieval homes, especially for peasants, were not built like our sturdy, insulated houses. They were smaller, less secure, often made of wood or wattle and daub, with doors that could be lifted off their hinges and windows without glass. For many families, the idea of leaving someone to sleep alone in such conditions felt vulnerable. Sleeping together offered a kind of protection, a reassurance that if something happened, a fire, a wild animal, or an intruder, there would be others nearby to help. Even among the wealthy, who might have more secure stone homes or castles, sleeping alone was rare. Servants often slept near their masters, and traveling guests might share beds simply because it was practical. In an age before central heating, sleeping beside someone also meant warmth, which was no small consideration during bitterly cold winters. For peasants, a family bed was common: parents, children, and sometimes even a visiting relative all sleeping in one shared space. The idea wasn't seen as strange or uncomfortable, it was just life. People grew up accustomed to hearing others breathe beside them or stir during the night. This closeness also created a sense of connection and calm. Falling asleep knowing your loved ones were right there brought a level of reassurance that many of us, isolated in separate rooms, rarely experience today. And then there's the cultural perspective. Waking up in the middle of the night was expected, not alarming. In a shared sleeping space, if one person awoke and stirred, it wasn't seen as disruptive because everyone understood that night waking was normal. Maybe someone got up to tend a fire or say a prayer, and then they quietly returned to bed. There wasn't frustration about ruining someone's sleep cycle, because the concept of 8 uninterrupted hours simply didn't exist. Modern sleep science actually supports some of the benefits that communal sleeping provided. Sharing a sleeping space can lower anxiety, particularly in environments where safety is a concern. Even today, many people find they sleep more deeply with a partner next to them, or even with a pet at their feet. That innate comfort, knowing someone else is close by, has deep evolutionary roots. For medieval people, who lived in a world where threats were far more tangible than ours, it made even more sense. Think of it, no police departments as we know them, no deadbolt locks, no neighborhood lighting. Nighttime in the countryside could be pitch black and eerily silent, broken only by the howl of a distant wolf or the creak of a tree in the wind. Sleeping with others wasn't just convenient, it was psychologically soothing. It turned night into something shared, less intimidating, and even social. For travelers, shared beds were also simply practical. Inns were limited and expensive, and rooms weren't always plentiful. Two strangers might share a bed not because they knew each other, but because that was the only available sleeping arrangement. And surprisingly, this wasn't seen as odd or scandalous, it was normal. Manuals from the period even gave advice on how to politely share a bed with someone you didn't know, essentially medieval bed manners. This tradition also carried into cities, where apprentices or workers might sleep in shared quarters, sometimes several to a room. For many, it reinforced the idea of community. The day might be for work and trade, but the night was for rest, and rest was a collective experience. Contrast that with today's mindset. If someone suggests you share a bed with anyone outside your immediate family, it feels deeply unusual. We've grown up expecting separation and privacy as a sign of comfort and status. Yet in the medieval world, privacy was rare and often unimportant. Safety and warmth mattered more, and the act of sleeping itself was more flexible, less pressured, and more communal. In a way, sleeping together in the Middle Ages parallels the biphasic sleep pattern we talked about earlier. Both show how people adapted to their world instead of fighting against it. Sharing space created not only physical security but also emotional calm. When the body relaxed into sleep, it did so with the comfort of knowing others were near. And because everyone was used to waking up at least once in the night, there was no awkwardness or irritation about someone else stirring. Nighttime was a shared experience, and so was the responsibility of rest. This closeness also influenced how people viewed nighttime itself. Rather than being an isolating or lonely time, it was part of family and social life. You weren't alone in the dark, you were surrounded by the people you trusted most, or at least the people who shared your work and your life. That kind of connection, even in sleep, fostered a level of security and peace that we often have to create artificially today, with security systems, nightlights, or even apps that play the sounds of other people's breathing just to feel less alone. When we look at how medieval people embraced communal sleeping, it's tempting to romanticize it. Of course, it wasn't always comfortable, beds were often lumpy and scratchy, and personal space was minimal. But at the heart of it, the practice was about shared safety and reassurance, something we're rediscovering in small ways today through things like co-sleeping with infants, sleeping next to pets, or choosing to keep bedrooms close together in family homes. In the end, medieval people didn't fear the night the way we sometimes do, because they didn't face it alone. They shared it, and in sharing it, they made it less intimidating. That sense of comfort, falling asleep knowing others were nearby, is one more reason their sleep might have been deeper and more peaceful than ours, even without our modern mattresses and sleep technology. Another key difference between medieval sleep and ours lay in what they actually slept on. Today, we have a seemingly endless array of options: spring mattresses, memory foam, hybrid designs promising orthopedic support, and even adjustable bases that raise and lower with the press of a button. Back in the Middle Ages, none of that existed. But that doesn't mean their beds were uncomfortable or primitive. In many ways, they were surprisingly well thought out, crafted from natural materials perfectly suited to their world. For most common households, the bed began with a simple wooden frame or, in more modest homes, just a sturdy platform raised slightly off the ground. On top of that went a mattress, but not the kind we imagine today. Medieval mattresses were often stuffed with straw or hay, materials that were abundant, inexpensive, and easy to replace. Straw-filled mattresses might sound rough by modern standards, but for people used to hard work and simple living, they were practical and comfortable enough, especially when topped with layers of wool or linen. Wool was an essential bedding material, and not just for blankets. Thick woolen padding added warmth and softness, helping to regulate temperature on cold nights and wick away moisture in the summer. Linen sheets were common as well, prized for their durability and their ability to keep cool against the skin. For wealthier families, feathers were the gold standard. Down-stuffed mattresses or pillows filled with goose or duck feathers were highly valued, offering a level of softness and luxury that set the upper classes apart. Beyond basic comfort, these natural materials had another hidden advantage: they breathed. Unlike modern synthetic fabrics, which can trap heat and moisture, straw, wool, and linen allowed air to circulate. That meant sleeping in a more natural microclimate, one that stayed warm without becoming stifling and remained cool enough to be comfortable even in summer. In an age without air conditioning or electric fans, this was more than just a perk, it was an essential feature for good rest. There was also a practical element of pest control. Straw mattresses, for instance, were often refreshed and replaced periodically, keeping bugs and vermin from becoming long-term residents. Families even mixed certain herbs into their bedding, partly for fragrance but also to deter insects. Lavender and chamomile were two favorites, not only because their scents were pleasant and calming, but also because they were believed to have protective properties. Laying down on a bed that smelled faintly of flowers and greenery added a small but meaningful layer of comfort, turning even a simple straw mattress into a place of relaxation. And while these beds might seem basic compared to ours, they were deeply personal. Bedding was often handmade, with family members sewing mattress covers, spinning and weaving sheets, or carefully tending feather pillows for years. The bed itself was sometimes one of the most valuable pieces of furniture in a household, passed down through generations. In wealthier homes, bed frames could be elaborate, with carved posts, heavy curtains, and embroidered canopies designed not only for decoration but also to block drafts and create a cocoon-like sense of privacy and warmth. These sleeping arrangements reflected a way of life that prioritized natural solutions and simple comforts. People didn't need high-tech materials to sleep well because they worked with what the land provided, and they worked with it intelligently. Straw and feathers might not contour to the body the way memory foam does, but they kept people warm, dry, and comfortable enough to rest deeply after long days of physical labor. And when you think about it, that's what matters most. Beds are only as good as the sleep they support, and medieval people slept remarkably well. What's fascinating is how some of these ideas are coming back today. Modern bedding companies boast about organic cotton, breathable linen, natural wool toppers, and even herbal sleep sprays designed to mimic scents like lavender, essentially, a return to what medieval households had been doing naturally for centuries. The difference is that for them, it wasn't luxury marketing, it was everyday life. It's easy to picture the experience. After a day of work, you step into a dimly lit room, your bed waiting with its herbal scent and natural textures. The mattress isn't perfect by our standards, it might be a little uneven or firm in spots, but it's warm, breathable, and familiar. You lie down under a woolen blanket, hearing the faint crackle of the fire or the quiet breathing of others nearby, and drift off surrounded by the comforting smell of lavender and fresh linen. This kind of environment created a sense of grounding. Everything about the bed, from the materials to the homemade craftsmanship, reminded people of the rhythms of nature and the home they belonged to. That connection, subtle as it might seem, has a powerful effect on how easily we fall asleep and how deeply we rest. So while our modern beds may look and feel more advanced, medieval bedding had its own wisdom. It worked with nature instead of against it, relied on renewable materials, and even incorporated elements designed to calm the senses. And when combined with the deep darkness of their nights and the communal comfort of sleeping near loved ones, it's easy to see why so many medieval people might have enjoyed a deeper, more restorative rest than we often manage today, no memory foam required. If there was one thing medieval people seemed to understand intuitively, it was how what you consumed before bed shaped how you slept. Today, we talk about sleep-friendly foods and herbal teas as if they're new discoveries, but these practices were already part of daily life centuries ago. For starters, evening meals were often light and early. Most people in medieval villages finished supper by 5 or 6 in the evening, long before darkness fully settled. It wasn't just tradition, it made sense in a world without artificial lighting and where heavy labor dominated the day. Eating late or eating heavy wasn't practical, especially when your body needed to rest, not spend hours digesting a massive meal. Instead, dinners were often simple but nourishing, a bit of bread, some seasonal vegetables, perhaps some dairy or a small portion of meat. Interestingly, many of these foods naturally encouraged sleep. Take milk, for example, commonly consumed warm or with a bit of honey. It's rich in tryptophan, an amino acid that helps the body produce serotonin and melatonin, which are key to falling asleep. Almonds were another common food, whether eaten whole or used in cooking, and they, too, are high in nutrients linked to better rest. Even lettuce made its way into evening meals and remedies, with some herbal texts from the period recommending it specifically for calming the body and preparing for sleep. But perhaps the most fascinating part of medieval sleep preparation came from their love of herbs. Long before the age of supplements and packaged teas, people used what grew in their gardens or nearby fields. Chamomile, for instance, was widely known for its soothing properties. A warm chamomile infusion before bed could relax the nerves and quiet the mind, making it easier to drift off. Valerian root, still used today as a natural sleep aid, was another favorite. It had a stronger, earthier flavor, but many people swore by its calming effect on the body. Then there were hops, the same plant used in brewing beer. While today we associate hops primarily with beverages, medieval people understood its mild sedative qualities. A small amount used in herbal tonics or tucked into sleep pillows helped promote relaxation. These weren't one-off solutions, they were a regular part of life. Herbal knowledge was passed down through families and often written in household recipe books, meaning people treated herbs not as exotic medicine but as everyday tools for well-being. This connection between food, herbs, and rest wasn't just practical, it was cultural. People believed that how you ended your day mattered. Going to bed on an overly full stomach was considered bad for the spirit and the body. Light meals and calming herbs weren't simply about falling asleep faster, they reflected a broader approach to balance and health. A day might be filled with exhausting work, but the evening belonged to recovery, reflection, and, eventually, sleep. It's also worth noting that these remedies were accessible to almost everyone. You didn't need to be wealthy to grow chamomile or lettuce or to keep a few almonds or a jar of honey in the pantry. In fact, many of the herbs used for relaxation grew wild, ready to be gathered and dried for use throughout the year. Modern science has validated many of these choices. Chamomile, for example, contains apigenin, a compound that binds to receptors in the brain and reduces anxiety, while valerian has compounds that may increase levels of gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, helping to quiet the nervous system. Tryptophan-rich foods like milk and almonds really do assist with sleep hormone production. It's remarkable to think that medieval people were practicing sleep hygiene on a nutritional level long before research gave us the vocabulary to explain why it worked. Imagine ending your evening in that world. You finish a light supper just as the sun sets, maybe with a small cup of warm milk or a handful of nuts. The house grows dim, lit only by the flicker of a candle, and someone brews a simple herbal drink, its fragrance filling the room. Outside, the night settles in, quiet and natural. There's no rush, no last-minute fast food run, no screen glowing in your face as you eat. Instead, you're preparing both body and mind for rest, slowly, gently, intentionally. This wasn't luxury or self-care, it was life. People didn't view these habits as special rituals, they were as ordinary as putting out the fire before bed or saying an evening prayer. But their effect on sleep quality was profound. With lighter meals and calming herbs, the body could focus on rest rather than digestion. And with the absence of stimulants like coffee or processed sugar so common in modern diets, sleep came naturally, without much struggle. There's a lesson in that simplicity. Today, we often complicate sleep with pills, gadgets, and endless advice, yet one of the oldest solutions is the easiest: eat light, eat early, and use what nature gives you to relax. The medieval world might have lacked modern luxuries, but they had a deep understanding of rhythm, routine, and the healing power of simple things. And when you think about how deeply they slept, on their straw beds, under wool blankets, in the quiet dark, it's hard not to feel a little envious. One of the most beautiful parts of medieval sleep culture wasn't just how they went to bed, but how they woke up. Today, waking often feels like an ambush. An alarm clock blares or a phone buzzes with a sound designed to be irritating enough that you can't ignore it. The body jolts awake, often in the middle of a sleep cycle, leaving you groggy, disoriented, and maybe even a little grumpy. Medieval mornings were nothing like that. For one thing, there were no alarms. People woke when their bodies were ready, usually nudged awake by the gradual changes of the world around them. As dawn crept across the sky, soft light filtered into their rooms, stirring the senses gently. It wasn't the harsh blast of a ceiling light or the blue glare of a phone screen, it was sunlight, warm, golden, and natural. For many, this was the body's perfect wake-up call, aligning seamlessly with their natural circadian rhythm. But light wasn't the only cue. There were sounds, too, the kind of everyday noises we rarely notice anymore. The rooster crowing outside, signaling morning as reliably as any clock. The distant peal of church bells marking early prayers or the start of a workday. Sometimes it was the quiet murmur of neighbors already up and tending to chores, or the rhythmic clatter of someone chopping wood outside. These sounds weren't intrusive, they were part of the fabric of life. They were familiar and grounding, easing people into wakefulness instead of yanking them out of it. Imagine lying in bed on a medieval morning. The first thing you feel is the soft warmth of sunlight touching your face. You hear a faint rustle of movement outside, maybe someone leading animals out to pasture or the faint ringing of a handbell calling people to early mass. There's no panic, no desperate reaching for a snooze button. You simply open your eyes, stretch, and let yourself drift into wakefulness at your own pace. Waking up like this does something to the mind. It sets the tone for the day in a way modern alarms rarely can. You aren't immediately in fight or flight mode because of a jarring sound. You aren't instantly flooded with phone notifications pulling you into work emails, social media feeds, and breaking news before you've even sat up. Instead, you wake naturally, your body deciding when it's ready to move from rest to action. It's an easier transition, one that leaves you feeling calmer and more grounded. This wasn't just luck, it was part of the rhythm of medieval life. People went to bed earlier, followed the natural patterns of light and dark, and woke up in harmony with them. The day didn't demand their attention through artificial cues, it invited them gently with signals from the world itself. Even work schedules reflected this slower start. Farmers didn't need alarms because they knew the day began when the sun rose, not when a digital clock said it was time. Craftsmen and merchants started work based on daylight and local tradition, not the piercing beep of a smartphone. We might assume that without alarms people would oversleep, but that's rarely the case when you live by natural light. The body has its own internal clock, and when it's allowed to run without interference, it tends to sync with the environment. In medieval times, this meant waking up with or shortly after sunrise, refreshed and ready to face the day. And because they often practiced biphasic sleep, those two separate phases of rest, they often greeted morning having already had hours of deep sleep and a moment of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. Contrast that with how we wake today. Alarms are abrupt, often breaking us out of deep REM sleep, which can leave us feeling disoriented for much of the morning. We rely on caffeine to jolt us into functionality, and we sometimes resent mornings altogether. Medieval mornings, though, were less about rushing and more about aligning. They didn't have to wake up on time in the way we do, they simply woke up with time, the time nature offered, the time the community kept. There's a reason why many sleep experts now recommend letting natural light into your room in the morning or using wake-up lamps that gradually brighten instead of jolting you awake. Our bodies evolved to respond to the soft light of dawn and the subtle sounds of morning life. The medieval world delivered exactly that without even trying. Even the sounds of the morning had meaning. A rooster crow wasn't just noise, it was life continuing. Church bells weren't just signals, they were a comforting reminder of the day's rhythm, marking time in a way that felt human and spiritual rather than mechanical. The world itself woke with you, and that sense of shared experience, of humans, animals, and nature rising together, gave mornings a kind of quiet poetry we've largely lost. So imagine starting your day the medieval way, no alarms, no rush, just waking as sunlight slowly brightens the room, with sounds of daily life drifting in from outside. You stretch, sit up, and feel like the day is beginning with you rather than against you. It's a small difference, but it changes everything about how you step into the world. It's not just waking up, it's waking well. Another major reason medieval people seemed to sleep so deeply and easily was simple: their days were full of physical movement and natural light. In our world, many of us spend long hours sitting, at desks, in cars, in front of screens, and then wonder why we struggle to fall asleep at night. Medieval life was the opposite. It required movement, and lots of it. For most people, work wasn't something you sat down to do, it was physical by nature. Farmers spent their days tending fields, plowing soil, harvesting crops, and caring for animals. Shepherds walked miles over open land to watch their flocks. Craftsmen stood for hours, using their hands and upper bodies to shape wood, forge iron, or weave textiles. Even daily tasks like gathering water, chopping wood, and baking bread involved steady, rhythmic motion. There was no gym membership required because life itself was exercise. This constant movement had an obvious effect: by nightfall, the body was ready, truly ready, to rest. It wasn't the mental fatigue we often feel today, where your mind is tired but your body has been sedentary all day. Medieval fatigue was physical, tangible, and deeply satisfying. Muscles used from head to toe welcomed a chance to recover, and that recovery happened in sleep. And then there was sunlight. People in the Middle Ages spent much of their day outside, exposed to natural light from dawn until dusk. Farmers worked fields under the open sky. Market vendors stood outside selling goods. Children played outdoors. Even chores done at home often happened near open doorways or windows, simply because natural light was necessary for seeing what you were doing. There was no such thing as fluorescent lighting humming overhead or hours spent under dim, artificial bulbs. Exposure to sunlight plays a huge role in regulating our internal clocks, something sleep scientists today call the circadian rhythm. Morning and midday sun help signal to the body when it's time to be awake and alert, and as daylight fades, the body naturally begins preparing for rest. Medieval people, without even thinking about it, lived perfectly in sync with that rhythm. They didn't have to schedule sun breaks or worry about getting enough light, they got it by default just by living their daily lives. This combination, physical activity plus natural light, made it easy to drift off when evening came. There was no tossing and turning, staring at the ceiling while thinking, "Why can't I sleep?" The body's systems were already primed for rest, energy spent, hormones aligned, muscles craving recovery. And because they typically ate lighter dinners and avoided stimulating foods or drinks before bed, there was nothing working against that natural urge to sleep. Think of what that must have felt like. After a long day in the fields or workshops, you return home, share a simple evening meal, and sit by the fire as darkness slowly settles in. Your body feels heavy, pleasantly sore, and relaxed in a way only physical work can bring. By the time you climb into bed, whether it's straw-stuffed or feather-filled, you don't need to count sheep or scroll through a phone to distract your mind. Your body takes over, and within minutes you're fast asleep. Contrast that with our world, where many of us spend our days indoors under artificial lights, moving mostly from one chair to another. By evening, we're often mentally exhausted but physically restless. We then spend our wind-down time staring at screens that emit blue light, which tricks the brain into thinking it's still daytime, and then wonder why sleep doesn't come easily. Medieval life didn't have this conflict. The rhythm of physical effort during the day and restful sleep at night happened naturally. Interestingly, modern research has shown that regular physical activity and exposure to sunlight are two of the best ways to improve sleep quality. People who exercise during the day tend to fall asleep faster and experience deeper sleep cycles. Sunlight helps boost serotonin during the day, which converts to melatonin at night, making it easier to relax into slumber. The Middle Ages provided both without any conscious effort. They weren't trying to hack sleep, they were just living in a way that supported it. Even in the colder months, when days were shorter and work sometimes shifted indoors, people still moved more than we typically do today. Carrying firewood, hauling water, mending tools, or even walking longer distances just to visit a neighbor, all these actions kept the body engaged. And because there were no modern conveniences like elevators, washing machines, or cars, even basic living burned energy. This meant that by bedtime, sleep wasn't something you had to chase, it was something that came to you. The body wanted it. And in that way, medieval people experienced something we often struggle to recreate with sleep apps, supplements, or bedtime routines: the simple, satisfying exhaustion of a naturally active life. When we think about their world, it's easy to romanticize the quiet nights and herbal-scented beds, but this physical connection to the day's labor might be one of the biggest reasons their sleep was so deep and restorative. They didn't have to worry about whether they'd done enough steps or closed their activity rings, because movement was built into everything they did. By the time darkness fell, sleep wasn't an option, it was inevitable. One of the most striking differences between medieval life and ours lies in how quiet their evenings were. Today, the world never really stops. Even late at night, there are cars rushing down the streets, neon signs glowing, and the low hum of life that doesn't seem to sleep. Restaurants stay open until midnight or later, grocery stores run 24 hours, and even if your street is quiet, your phone still buzzes with notifications at all hours. Medieval evenings were nothing like that. Back then, life moved at a slower pace. There were no cars, no electricity, no televisions flashing in windows, and no traffic noise filling the air long after dark. When the sun went down, most of the day's activity slowed too. Shops closed, markets emptied, and people retreated to their homes. The world outside grew calm. Nights belonged to stillness, punctuated only by the soft sounds of nature, a breeze rustling through trees, the chirp of crickets, or maybe the distant bark of a dog keeping watch. This kind of natural quiet does something to the mind. It signals that it's time to wind down, to shift from the pace of day to the rhythm of rest. Without the sensory overload we're so used to today, bright lights, screens, and constant stimulation, medieval people had an easier path toward relaxation. The evening wasn't a time to catch up on work or scroll endlessly, it was for slowing down, talking with family, maybe reading or mending clothes by firelight and preparing for sleep. Even villages and towns with taverns or gatherings didn't create the kind of noise pollution we experience now. A busy night in a medieval town might mean a handful of people laughing on their way home or the muffled sound of music from inside a building. Compare that to the sirens, honking horns, and all-night parties of modern cities, and it's easy to see why medieval evenings felt so different. And without artificial lighting, people naturally followed the sun's lead. When daylight faded, most activity ended. There was little incentive to stay up late because candles and oil lamps were costly and often reserved for necessary tasks. This created an environment where quiet evenings weren't the exception, they were the rule. Homes became places of rest and reflection, not secondary workspaces lit up by glowing screens. Imagine what that must have felt like. After supper, you might sit by the fire with your family, perhaps listening to a story or simply enjoying the crackling warmth. Outside, the streets are empty, and a deep stillness settles over everything. You step outside for a moment and hear almost nothing but the faint whisper of wind or the soft call of an owl in the distance. There are no engines revving, no music blaring, no late-night deliveries or garbage trucks rumbling by. It's just quiet. That kind of environment naturally prepares the body for rest. Modern research shows that exposure to loud noise and artificial light in the evening can delay sleep and reduce its quality. Medieval people didn't have to worry about that because their nights were naturally peaceful. This absence of overstimulation gave their nervous systems a chance to settle, allowing them to fall asleep more easily and stay asleep longer. It also shaped how they thought about evening itself. Today, we often treat evening as an extension of the workday or a time for endless entertainment. We watch bright screens until midnight, check emails one last time, and even eat late-night snacks, all of which keep the brain wired and alert. In the medieval world, evenings were for winding down and preparing for the next day. The slow pace of life allowed people to transition naturally into rest instead of forcing themselves to crash into it after hours of mental stimulation. Even in busier towns and cities of the Middle Ages, the design of life itself encouraged quiet. Streets weren't lit like daylight, so wandering late at night was rare and sometimes unsafe. That meant fewer disturbances and more respect for nighttime peace. For rural communities, where most people lived, the night could be almost silent, save for the sounds of nature. That stillness became part of the rhythm of life, making it easier to associate night with relaxation instead of with endless activity. And it wasn't just about the absence of noise, it was about the absence of hurry. Life itself moved more slowly. Without cars or trains, without the pressure to respond to emails or check notifications, people had more natural pauses built into their days. Evening was one of those pauses, a chance to sit, to think, to simply be before slipping into sleep. That slower pace created a mental state that modern life rarely allows. When you combine that with all the other factors, physical activity during the day, exposure to natural light, lighter evening meals, and herbal remedies, it's no wonder medieval people often slept so deeply. Their world, by design or by necessity, created perfect conditions for rest. Imagine ending your day in that world. There's no city noise seeping through your walls, no glow of streetlights outside your window, and no temptation to just check one more thing on your phone. Instead, the day slows naturally to a quiet end. You hear only wind, insects, maybe the faint toll of a church bell marking the hour. You stretch, climb into bed, and drift into sleep without distraction. That kind of calm isn't just restful, it's healing. For us, it's a reminder that sometimes the best sleep isn't about expensive mattresses or apps that track your REM cycles. Sometimes, it's about creating quiet, about learning from a world that didn't know what constant noise and activity felt like. The Middle Ages may have been rough in many ways, but when it came to evenings, they had something we've largely lost, the peace to simply let the day end, slowly and quietly, with space for the body and mind to truly rest. One of the greatest differences between medieval life and ours wasn't just in how people slept, but in how they treated the hours leading up to it. They had something we often lack today, a balance between work and rest. Medieval people worked hard, there's no denying that. Most days were filled with physically demanding labor, whether it was tending crops, raising animals, building, weaving, or crafting. Life wasn't leisurely, and there was no such thing as a day off in the way we think of it now. But when evening came, there was an unspoken shift. The day's work was done, and it stayed done. There were no office emails, no side hustles calling for late-night attention, and no glowing computer screens tempting people to squeeze in just one more hour. Instead, evenings were deliberately slower. After supper, usually eaten earlier than we do today, people allowed their bodies and minds to unwind. Some spent time with family, others mended clothes or prepared for the next day, but these tasks were calm, repetitive, and often social. Even quiet moments by the fire or a few minutes in prayer were part of the routine, signaling to the body that it was time to leave the urgency of the day behind and prepare for rest. This created a crucial difference in mental state. Today, many of us carry our stress into the night. We spend evenings thinking about unfinished tasks, worrying about deadlines, or trying to cram more productivity into every waking hour. Our minds race long after our bodies are ready to rest, and that stress often steals our sleep. Medieval people, on the other hand, lived in a rhythm where evening truly belonged to restoration. Part of this came from necessity. Without electric lights or modern conveniences, there simply wasn't much work you could do after dark, especially outside. The natural end of daylight acted like a cultural pause button, encouraging people to slow down. And because work itself was often tied to the land or to daylight hours, there wasn't pressure to stay connected or always be available. There were no late-night meetings, no phones buzzing with reminders, and no news headlines keeping people glued to screens. This separation between work and rest helped reduce stress in subtle but powerful ways. When your body knows the evening is for slowing down, it responds accordingly. Heart rate decreases, stress hormones drop, and muscles begin to relax. That mental and physical calm acts as a bridge into deep, restorative sleep. Another thing medieval life had going for it was the sense of completion. For many of us today, work feels endless. We can always log on, always check one more thing. Medieval workers often had a clear sense of a day's work being finished. Plows were put away, animals were fed, workshops closed. There's a deep satisfaction in knowing your work for the day is truly done, and that satisfaction is incredibly helpful for sleep. Even social life reflected this balance. While gatherings, music, or storytelling certainly happened, they were often gentle, communal activities rather than high-stimulation distractions. These moments reinforced connection and reduced anxiety, creating a shared sense of winding down together. It's easier to sleep when everyone around you is also easing into rest instead of rushing to meet deadlines or binging another episode of a show at midnight. It's not to say medieval life was without stress, it certainly had its hardships, but the nature of that stress was different. It was more immediate, tied to weather, crops, or physical effort, and when those daily tasks were complete, the mind had permission to rest. In contrast, our modern stress often lingers, following us into bed through glowing screens and unfinished to-do lists. Modern researchers often talk about sleep hygiene and recommend habits like putting your phone away before bed or creating evening rituals to signal to the brain that it's time to relax. Medieval people didn't need those tips because their entire way of life naturally encouraged that separation. Evening itself was a ritual of slowing down. The fire dimmed, conversation quieted, and the day's pace softened into stillness. Imagine finishing a day in that rhythm. Your work is physical and tiring, but when the sun sets, the tools are put away, and you don't think about them until morning. You share a quiet meal, maybe tend to a few simple household chores, then spend the rest of the evening in calm conversation or quiet reflection. There's no pressure to be on for anyone, no pings or buzzing reminders to disrupt your peace. Your body, already tired from honest work, now has the mental calm to match it, and when you finally lie down, sleep comes easily, deep, satisfying, and uninterrupted. This balance between work and rest wasn't something they had to work at consciously, it was built into life itself. And in that way, medieval people had something we're trying to recreate now with wellness routines and mindfulness apps, a sense that the day has an endpoint, and that resting isn't wasted time but an essential part of living well. It's a reminder that sometimes the best sleep advice isn't about what kind of pillow you use or what temperature your room is, but about what kind of day and evening you create for yourself. The Middle Ages may not have had our technology or convenience, but they had a natural wisdom about life's rhythms that made good sleep not an exception, but the norm. And that's it for tonight's journey back in time, where people slept under quieter skies and woke to gentler mornings. Maybe their secret to better sleep wasn't fancy gadgets or apps, but simply a slower pace and a little respect for rest itself. If you enjoyed this story and want more relaxing journeys into history, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here on Thursday Na Storytime. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who could use a good night's sleep. Until next time, sweet dreams, and thanks for letting us be part of your bedtime.